All right, good evening, everyone. As you join in tonight, make sure your microphones are muted. If you have any issues with your video service being laggy, you can shut off your own camera. It might save you a little bit of bandwidth. Take it easy on your internet so that your viewing experience is better. If you have questions tonight during the presentation, please use the chat box for them. Don't try to ask your question using the video and microphone features, as too many people asking questions at once, you just don't get any questions at all. If you're watching live on Facebook, you can comment on the Facebook stream, and I will be watching for questions there. And then when we do our Q&A session at the very end, I will make sure to bring in questions from Facebook and from the Zoom chat. So if you put a question in either of those places, I will try to get to them, and we'll get to as many as we can as time allows at the end. We are live streaming on Facebook and recording on Zoom. So if you would like to see the closed caption version of this, there will be a closed caption version, and you'll just have to contact me directly for it at the end. I think that covers most everything. If you do unmute yourself at any point in time during the presentation, I will be just muting folks as necessary. However, if you continue to unmute yourself, I will just kick you off the call. So please make sure, keep yourself muted, nothing distracting in your video camera if possible. If you're obviously doing something crude or distracting in your video, I will have to boot you off the call that way too. So please just make sure, good, normal, etiquette, as if we were all sitting in a room together. It's unfortunate we can't be, but that's all right. Technology allows us to have amazing presenters like Jared Wolfe, who maybe we couldn't see otherwise. So sit back and enjoy. I'm going to present Jared tonight, and I will remove myself from your view. So Jared Wolfe is an assistant professor at Michigan Technological University, where he studies birds, habitat ecology, migration, and avian molts and plumages in temperate and tropical forests. Jared is particularly interested in how a bird's molt is evolutionarily shaped by their ecological niche and environment. In collaboration with talented colleagues, Jared co-founded the Louisiana Bird Observatory, the first year-round bird banding initiative in that state, and the Biodiversity Initiative, a nonprofit focused on wildlife conservation, education, and exploration in Central Africa. So Jared, I am going to take myself out now, and the rest is yours.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Zach, and thanks to Holly for the invitation to deliver this seminar. It's really cool seeing some old friends in the viewing audience. Sue Dong from South Korea, I haven't seen in years, was one of the first bird banding volunteers as a visiting professor from South Korea and Louisiana, and Arthur Sanchez, a good friend from California. So yeah, hi everybody. It's great to see folks, even if virtually. Hey Arthur. So before I jump into this talk, I briefly want to talk about first what this talk is not, and second what this talk is. This seminar is not an in-depth review or treatment of bird molt and plumages, micro-aging techniques using molt limits. If you guys want that talk, the seminar prior to this one that's available on WBBA's Facebook page, Daniel Kashubi from the Institute of Bird Populations gave a great seminar on that. So hopefully everyone saw that talk and has that kind of background knowledge necessary to get the most out of this seminar. Second, what the seminar is a gentle introduction to the Wolfe-Ryder-Pyle, or the WRP age classification system. And the genesis of the WRP system really came about through perceived inadequacies with the official age classification system that we use in North America, and that's the calendar year system. So before I jump into the WRP system, I just briefly want to chat about the use of the calendar year system, how it's been misapplied, particularly in tropical and biodiverse environments around the world, and that giving rise to really the need for a new universal system of age classification. So for me, when I think about the calendar year system, it's really based on three principles, right? The first principle is all birds have their birthday on January 1st. I don't mean they literally hatch on January 1st. That's ridiculous. I mean, the transition from one age code to the next occurs on January 1st. For example, if we had a bird that was hatched in the spring of 2020, let's say a black-capped chickadee, and we banded that bird every week, and the last time we banded it, we pulled it off its night roost on New Year's Eve on December 31st at 11:58, that bird is a hatching year bird. 2 minutes later at New Year's, that bird becomes a second year bird. That bird did not change in any meaningful way, reflecting that January 1st is a date that we impose on that bird. It has no biological significance. It's an important date for us because we like to party, but that's it. So we're imposing this completely arbitrary date on the birds and having them transition their age codes around this biologically insignificant date. The second principle is the calendar year system only works if breeding seasons are highly seasonal and don't overlap January 1st. If breeding seasons become less seasonal or eruptive, or if breeding seasons start overlapping January 1st, the calendar year system falls apart. So you could imagine, for example, if we're working with a species that's eruptive in breeding, and they could be hatching chicks on December 31st or January 1st, and we capture a young bird several months down the road, maybe in March, and it has a molt limit, so we know that this bird was fledged out of the nest several months ago. We don't know if it was before January 1st or after January 1st. Is it a hatching year bird? Is it a second year bird? We don't know. So the system completely falls apart. Importantly, what the system is really good at is separating cohorts. That's about it. That's what it does, right? It separates cohorts in highly seasonal environments in the Northern Hemisphere. Importantly, it provides no information about the life cycle phonology birds, what stage within the life cycle a particular bird that you've captured is currently in. So let me just really briefly run through kind of the process that I use when I'm using the calendar year system to age birds. The first thing I do is I put on my detective's cap and I use little clues, whether that's skull ossification, molt limits, presence of juvenile plumage, to try to identify what plumage the bird is in. Is it a juvenile bird? Is it a formative plumage bird? Is it a first alternate plumage bird, and so forth? Once I've determined what plumage it is, I use that information to try to estimate when that bird was hatched. Was it hatched this year? Did it hatch last year? And then once I determine when that bird hatched, I count January 1st dates going forward. If it didn't cross any January 1st dates, it's a hatching year bird. If it was last year, hatched last year, it crossed one, the second year bird, and so forth. And this process is reflected in the official age codes from the bird banding lab. Here's just a screen capture from the USGS. And if we look at a couple example age codes, here is after second year, for example, a bird known to have hatched earlier than the calendar year preceding the year of banding, right? When I first started banding, these codes confused me. They still actually confuse me. I know what they mean. Clearly, I've banded thousands of birds. But if I capture a bird in the fall and it's going through a molt, I have to run through this whole three-step process to, okay, what plumage is it in? When was it hatched? Counting January 1st dates. It's not an intuitive system, is my point. And when I was learning how to band birds and age birds, it always struck me, why don't we just stick with the plumage? Why don't we just identify the plumage the bird is in and stop with these last two steps, right? And that really is kind of the precursor for WRP. That's all it really does, is we're just classifying the age of birds based on the plumage that we are documenting in the field. But back to the calendar year system. Let's talk a little bit more about its inadequacies, particularly when we leave the political boundaries of Canada or the United States. What about birds that breed around January 1st? Even within North America, we have eruptive breeders like red crossbill, Anna's hummingbird, that can breed around January 1st. Birds in the Southern Hemisphere, even in temperate zones, will breed across January 1st. This is why variations of the calendar year system in places like Australia, they'll use July 6th instead of January 1st to get around this problem. Tropical birds, of course, suffer from this. In the Amazon basin, for example, where I've done a lot of work, you'll still have seasonal breeding seasons of birds. However, many of them will encompass the January 1st date. But nonetheless, when I was a young researcher starting to do work and working with birds in tropical latitudes, researchers were coming from the United States and Canada and coming to the tropics and teaching this system. And I thought that was completely inappropriate, given that the system is one, not that intuitive of a system, and second, falls apart when you leave the temperate systems in North America. So what you find a lot of people who've worked for a long period of time in the tropics start doing is they realize they can't use a calendar year system. It's somewhat useless in Amazonian systems, for example. So they default to more simple categories of age: young, mature, old. But look at this bird on the right of your screen. This is a female white-crowned manakin, and you can see it has a molt limit in the greater coverts, indicative of a formative plumage bird. So what would you call this bird using these systems, right? This is a sexually mature bird. It can breed in this plumage, but would you call it mature? I wouldn't. That wouldn't make much sense. It has a molt limit. But would you call it young? Well, it can sexually breed. It's not necessarily young, right? So these kind of ad hoc age codes that are being developed for tropical birds are really quite screwy. So just want to hit home this point that the calendar year system was developed exclusively for temperate birds. And not just temperate birds that occur in North America, because if you go to temperate systems in the southern hemispheres, it doesn't work, or you have to change the dates. And it's incredibly biased because the majority of the world's avian diversity occurs in tropical latitudes, right? Here's a heat map showing species richness around the globe. This was developed by Yale University, where the deep red is indicative of high species richness. And you can see these biodiversity hotspots throughout tropical rainforests in these equatorial regions. So people who have developed this system in North America are coming down and teaching or trying to apply it in some of the most biodiverse systems in the world. And it really struck me as completely inappropriate. So there's clearly a need for a new aging system. And ideally, this aging system would be universal across latitudes, right? It's not just useful in temperate systems or northern hemispheres. It ideally will be universal across species. You could use it for an albatross, or you could use it for a hummingbird. It should be intuitive and easily learned. And by this, I mean, it should be biologically meaningful. If you understand the biology of the bird or the life cycle phonology of the bird, you should be able to age the bird. This would be ideal. And I believe molts and plumages provide the framework to tackle all of these points, creating a universal system that can be used across latitudes. And it's very biologically centric. It's not just based on an arbitrary date of January 1st that we use to have birds transition age codes. The reason being is that these annual molts that we refer to as a pre-basic molt appear to be deeply evolutionarily conserved. All birds appear to exhibit these molts, and that can serve once again as a framework for a system. Importantly, birds appear to never skip their annual molts or their pre-basic molts. If you get into the literature, there's an example from the Falkland Islands of some geese that might occasionally skip a molt cycle. I asked Peter Pyle in his study of gulls. He suggested maybe a large gull, but as we all know in ecology and natural systems, there's exceptions to rules. And this is one of the more hard, fast rules, I think, in ecology. Birds just don't skip their annual molt cycle. It's exceedingly rare, it seems. And importantly, molt extents often vary by age class. And this provides that variation within the life cycle of a bird to identify biologically meaningful periods and associate age with them, right? So just I want to give a brief overview of molts. before we introduce the WRP system, particularly an introduction to some of the framework upon which we classify molts in North America. We use the Humphrey-Park system. This was modified in 2003 by Howell, so we call it the Howell Modified Humphrey-Parks system, and it's based on the evolutionary relationships of molt. And within evolutionary framework, we understand that simplicity precedes complexity, right? If you have an ancestral organism, its molt, in theory, would be quite simple, and then as over evolutionary time periods, that molt might become more and more complex as selective forces operated on it, driving the evolution and complexity of that molt. So we can assume that some of the first molts were quite simple and occurred on an annual basis. And we could think of a phylogenetic tree, the base of that tree, that common ancestor would have this basal molt, right? This ancestral molt. And we could think of that word basal giving rise to the pre-basic molt, right? It's this basic molt that occurs among all birds, was shared by the common ancestor, and occurs roughly once a year. And just some housekeeping, when we have the prefix pre, that means the act of molting. And then when we lose that prefix, that means it's the plumage, the bird is done molting. So for example, the pre-basic molt will result in the basic plumage. And the pre-basic molt tends to occur after the breeding season and is shared widely across all birds. And the time in between pre-basic molts, these annual events, we call molt cycles. So the first pre-basic molt occurs in the nest. It's synonymous with the pre-juvenile molt. And then roughly a year later, give or take, we have the second pre-basic molt, and that would be the conclusion of the first molt cycle, right? First year of this bird's life. Importantly, upon this kind of simplistic framework of annual pre-basic molts, selective pressures, and these could be from migration, harsh environments, crypsis, sexual selection, result in what we call inserted molts. So within that simple framework of annual pre-basic molts, we have the evolution of inserted molts. These are pre-formative molts, pre-alternate molts, and so forth. And this is a really interesting field of study that's, I think, is just kind of coming online, is identifying those selective pressures within an evolutionary framework to try to determine how these molts arose, what selective pressures drove the evolution of these molts. For example, some great colleagues of mine, Ryan Terrell at Occidental College, as well as Glenn Seeholzer, we looked at some relationships between migratory distance of New World warblers, so parulids, and the extent, which means the amount of feathers replaced during the pre-alternate molt. And we found these very strong correlations. The closer to the equator migratory warblers get, the more feathers they replace during these inserted molts. And this makes sense because you could think of when a bird leaves here in the fall, days are getting shorter. If you stayed up in North America during the winter, you would have very little solar exposure during the winter. But if you migrate to the tropics, you're basically tracking the sun. As days get shorter here, they're getting longer in southern hemispheres. And so you're maximizing the amount of solar exposure on your feathers. So the longer distances you migrate, the more extensive your pre-alternate molts. And in fact, there's only 2 species of bird that have complete pre-alternate molts in North America. And that is the bobolink and Franklin's gull, both birds that breed at high latitudes, northerly latitudes, and then winter in the southern reaches of South America, where they have these very bright winters where they're being exposed to all types of sun. So point being, the evolution of these inserted molts can be understood in an evolutionary framework, and it's a rich area for research. It's quite fascinating. Here's some work from Ryan Terrell. This is a phylogenetic tree. Across the top, we have a diversity of bird families, and these nodes are representing splits from common ancestors, and the black is the predicted presence of the preformative molt. The take-home message here is the preformative molt is shared by so many species, it appears to be deeply evolutionarily conserved. And this makes sense when we think about the function that the preformative molt serves, right? Birds, when they're in a nest, they're highly susceptible to predation. They can't move through their environment freely. They're stuck in these nests. And So parents are feeding them food, feeding them protein-rich food resources, getting them to molt quickly. They're molting all at once in a synchronous fashion. And the trade-off is speedy molt for feather quality. They molt fast, but it's not of the highest quality, but they can leave the nest and survive, predation attempts as they're kind of fixed to that nest site. So the evolution of the pre-formative molt occurs just this one time within the first cycle of birds to replace those junky juvenile feathers that are poor quality because they grew fast. And probably because of this strong selective pressure, it arose early in evolutionary time and is expressed across a diversity of bird families. Conversely, here's the pre-alternate molt phylogenetic tree. Once again, all the bird families across the top, and this is from some of the great work done by Ryan Terrell. The black indicates the presence of the pre-alternate molt. And we can see here that when we say pre-alternate molt, this is a polyphyletic trait, meaning there's no common ancestor that gave rise to pre-alternate molts across birds. If we look at pre-alternate molts in gulls, those arose very differently and separately from pre-alternate molts in warblers. And in fact, when we look at New World warblers and prulids, we can see that pre-alternate molts will turn on and off over evolutionary time. So this is a highly labile molt subject to strong evolutionary forces that cause it to emerge and also go away for various reasons, how harsh the environment is and how long birds migrate and so forth. So just a little background on kind of the evolutionary structure, how we approach avian molts and why it's so useful for classifying bird age, because the pre-basic molt is universally expressed among birds, and so apparently is the pre-formative molt. It's been lost in several families and various species, but it's quite universal and probably quite ancient. So in 2003, Steve Howell suggested all birds can fall into one of 4 molt strategies, and these are based on the presence or absence of inserted molts within the first cycle. So if there is an inserted molt in the first cycle, which is typically the pre-formative molt, we'll call it complex. And if there's not, we'll call it simple. So if we look here, this first molt strategy we'll go over, simple basic strategy, it means that it's lacking that inserted molt in the first cycle. The second term, basic, suggests that, according to Howell, that these birds are lacking inserted molts in subsequent cycles. If you say alternate, it means there is an inserted molt in the first and subsequent cycles. So if you have complex alternate strategy, that means there's definitely a molt inserted in the first cycle. That's complex. And then a molt alternate inserted in the first cycle and subsequent cycles as well. So that would be a bird that would have a pre-formative molt and pre-alternate molts as well. So let's just go through the simple basic strategy to wrap our heads around this concept. And this is the simplest of the molt strategies exhibited by birds, and presumably reflects some of these ancestral molt strategies that birds went through. So we have a nest, a bird hatches, it instantly, it very quickly will start going through its pre-juvenile molt, which, just a reminder, is synonymous with the first pre-basic molt. They're the same thing, but because of the common parlance of the word juvenile, we call this the pre-juvenile molt. When it's done molting, it'll be in the juvenile plumage. Roughly about a year later, it'll undergo a second pre-basic molt, resulting in the second basic plumage, third pre-basic molt, etc. Just to wrap our heads around these molt cycle terms, the period of time from when it initiates its first pre-basic molt or its pre-juvenile molt to the time where it initiates its second pre-basic molt is that first molt cycle. Second molt cycle is from the second pre-basic molt to the third pre-basic molt, and so forth. Let's go through 2 more strategies that are more commonly exhibited by the songbirds and passerines that most of us work with. So this would be the complex basic strategy. Complex meaning has an inserted molt in the first cycle, which is the pre-formative molt, but no inserted molts in subsequent cycles. So this would be species like hermit thrush, Swainson's thrush, right? They have molt limits, they have pre-formative molts, but they don't have pre-alternate molts in subsequent cycles. So pre-juvenile molt, juvenile plumage, pre-formative molt, formative plumage. Here is that inserted molt, right? That pre-formative molt that's compensating for the poor quality juvenile plumage that was grown in rapidly in the nest to avoid predators to get it out of the nest, that chick. But now it's trying to mitigate that poor quality juvenile plumage by undergoing this inserted molt in the first cycle. This molt is often partial to incomplete, resulting in 2 generations of plumage, which is why we find molt limits in these birds. And they can be in this plumage for the year, breed in this plumage. After the breeding season, they'll go through a second pre-basic molt, which is complete, and now they'll be in their second basic plumage. Note I have in here the term definitive. When we say definitive with regards to a particular plumage, it means that it's now indistinguishable from subsequent plumages. So for example, if we have a second basic plumage, you don't really know for many of these species, unless it has delayed plumage maturation, whether this is the second basic plumage or third basic or fourth basic or fifth basic. They all look the same. So we have an umbrella term for that that we'll call definitive. So it's in a definitive basic plumage. So once again, just wrapping our heads around molt cycles, from the beginning of the prejuvenile molt to the second prebasic molt is the first molt cycle. Second prebasic molt to the third prebasic molt is the second molt cycle, and so forth. And if you have a juvenile plumage or a formative plumage, this will always be within the first molt cycle, right? You see juvenile plumage, you see formative plumage, hands down, it's in the first molt cycle. And you might be wondering, what's the point where a bird transitions from the first cycle to a second cycle? For a heuristic, which we suggest in some of the papers we've published, is the shedding of the first primary. So once it sheds its first primary during the second prebasic molt, it is now left the first molt cycle and entered the second molt cycle. Last strategy we'll go through before we jump into WRP codes, the complex alternate strategy. Complex, meaning it has an inserted molt within the first cycle. Alternate, meaning it has inserted molts in subsequent cycles. So these are birds that have preformative molts and pre-alternate molts, okay? So same deal, prejuvenile molt is juvenile plumage. Then they go through this preformative molt. Once again, this is that way to mitigate the poor quality juvenile plumage. So they have a formative plumage resulting in molt limits. But here they have that second inserted molt within the first cycle. This is the first pre-alternate molt. And pre-alternate molts are typically partial in extent, particularly among songbirds. So here we can have upwards of 3 generations of plumage, right? We can have the juvenile plumage that's left over from the nest. We can have the formative plumage, as well as now this alternate plumage laid on top of that. And once again, there's only 2 birds in North America that have complete pre-alternate molts. So exceedingly rare. They're almost always partial or incomplete or limited in extent. Then they have the second prebasic molt, which is typically complete, wiping the slate clean. Now they'll have their second pre-alternate molt, resulting in second alternate plumage, and so forth. And just once again, to wrap our heads around molt cycles, the first molt cycle from the prejuvenile molt all the way to the second prebasic molt. And once it sheds that first primary in the second prebasic molt, it has now entered its second molt cycle until it starts its third prebasic molt. Right? That was a lot thrown at everybody. If you're confused, I highly recommend going back and checking out Danny's talk. But this is, if you can wrap your head around these 4 molt strategies that were laid out in HAL 2003, then you have a good understanding of the diversity of molt strategies that are exhibited by birds around the globe. So based on these distinct plumages within these very distinct molt cycles, we developed the WRP system, the Wolfe-Ryder-Pyle system. And this is simply a convention for categorizing bird age, but it's based on something that's biologically meaningful. The ubiquitous presence of the prebasic molt, as well as variation in inserted molts that are dependent on species. It's a simple 3-coded system. And there's not a whole lot of tricks to it. It's a pretty easy system to wrap your head around. And a colleague of mine, Eric Johnson, he developed a way to teach this where he teaches the middle code first. And I found that to be quite effective. And so that's what we're going to do here. We're going to start with that middle or second code define it, use some examples, and then move on to the other two codes. So the second, this middle code, what is it? It's quite simple. If a bird is molting, in active molt, you put P for pre, like pre-basic molt, pre-alternate molt. If it's not molting, you put C for cycle. And this isn't, there's no trick associated with this. Let's just run through some examples. Here's a yellow rumped warbler captured in the fall in Northern California. You can see it's molting, right? It's going through a symmetrical wing molt. The only time this particular species would do this is during the pre-basic molt. So is this bird molting or not? Put a P, yeah, clearly it's molting. Here's another yellow rumped warbler. You can look at its wing. It's not undergoing any molt. So you put C for not molting, and that's it. So you've mastered the majority of the middle code. I guess, Zach, if people have pertinent questions or seem confused, feel free to chime in, but I'll assume that makes sense. It's pretty simple, and we'll move on to the next code, which will do the third code. So just remember the middle code is if it's molting or not, if it's molting P, if it's not C. The third code is equally simple. What plumage is the bird in? And the vast majority of plumages that you'll be working with are juvenile, formative, meaning it has a molt limit, basic, or alternate, or you don't know. You can say unknown. On some, not necessarily rare, it depends on the species you're working with, but I would say less common species, we can have supplemental for ptarmigans, and we can have auxiliary formative. And this is for northern cardinals and cardinalid buntings that exhibit this molt. So let's go through some examples. Here's a gray catbird. It's not looking very gray, it's pretty brown. That's because it is in a complete juvenile plumage. You can look at its wing. It's all fresh. Looks like this bird tumbled right out of the nest after it completed its pre-juvenile molt. So there's no molt, it's in juvenile plumage. You would look at its skull's completely open. What plumage is it? Not a trick question, it's juvenile, so J. Let's look at another catbird. Here's a bird that's a little older, and you can see that it has a molt limit in the greater coverts. So here's formative plumage here, contrasting with the shorter middle and outer greater coverts. It looks like this one was adventitiously replaced, but this is that classic block pattern that Peter Pyle talks about, right? In the pre-formative molt, it molts all the lesser and median coverts and some inner greater coverts, forming this nice block, contrasting with juvenile primary coverts and juvenile greater coverts and juvenile flight feathers. So you catch a bird with a molt limit like this. What plumage is it in? If you're following along at home, you can ask yourself, is this juvenile, formative, basic, or alternate? Not a trick question. It's formative plumage, right? Has that molt limit, it's indicative of formative plumage. Here's another gray catbird. Compared to the last bird, no molt limits. There's no step. This is all uniformly one plumage, the basic plumage. This bird would have a complete skull. So not a trick question, juvenile, formative, basic, or alternate, basic plumage bird, right? Okay, so now you've mastered the middle code and the last code. Middle code, is it molting or not? Last code, what plumage is it in? Now let's move on to the first code. This is simply what molt cycle the bird's in. And just a refresher, I know we covered this multiple times, but just to go over what first, second, definitive molt cycles are, you can use the letter F, S for first, second, D for definitive. And then once you get past third, you can use numbers fourth and fifth. Remember that molt cycles are defined as the period of time between pre-basic molt. So the first pre-basic molt, synonymous with the pre-juvenile molt, occurs in the nest, and it ends with the shedding of the first primary during the second pre-basic molt. At that point, the first molt cycle ends, and it enters the second molt cycle. And once again, we can say the second molt cycle for majority of birds we work with can be considered definitive because we cannot separate them from third, fourth, fifth, or subsequent molt cycles, right? So because of that, our inability to separate second, third, fourth, we have an umbrella term, definitive. So let's run through an example. Here's a Carolina wren from Louisiana. Has this fluffy juvenile plumage. We open the wing. This black barring in the wing is very diffuse. It's not very bright. There's a large space in between it. You can see the juvenile plumage on the back of this bird. If it's in juvenile plumage, what cycle is it in? Remember, juvenile and formative plumage birds are always in the first cycle, right? Not a trick question. Here's another Carolina wren. And during the preformative molt, these birds undergo eccentric preformative molts, meaning they molt blocks of secondaries and primaries, but not P1 or S1. So here, you can see that there's contrast between this inner secondary and this secondary here. The formative plumage secondaries have blacker barring and they're closer together. They're more dense than these black bars here. If you go out to the primaries, you can see once again that molt limit within the primaries here, where this rachis is blacker, this one is browner. These juvenile feathers have more diffuse black barring. They're spaced further apart. So you have these two molt limits, which is indicative of a formative plumage bird. If this bird's in formative plumage, which molt cycle is it in? First, second, definitive, or unknown? It's in first. It's in the first molt cycle. Here's another Carolina wren. This one is quite different than the first two in that the black barring is quite distinct. It's quite close together. It's dense, and there's no molt limits, right? So if there's no molt limits and there's no juvenile plumage, these birds don't have alternate plumages. So we know that this is a basic plumage outside the first cycle. It left formative plumage and is in the second, third, fourth, or subsequent cycles, but we don't know which cycle it's in. So we just say definitive. We just know it's not in the first. It's in a definitive cycle. Okay, so now that we've been introduced and you've mastered the WRP system, middle code, is it molting or not? Last code, what plumages is it in? First code, what cycle it's in? Let's go through and attribute WRP codes to this complex basic strategy here. So if a bird is molting in the nest, it's actively molting, it's a P, the middle code, it's molting into its juvenile plumage, so J, and which cycle it's in? First, FPJ. When it's done molting, still in its first cycle, it's not molting, so we put a C, and now it's in juvenile plumage, first cycle juvenile. Next, it wants to get rid of some of those poor quality juvenile feathers that it had to grow in quickly in the nest. So it's undergoing a preformative molt that's partial in extent. It's actively molting, so P, it's going into its formative plumage, so the last code is F, and it's in its first cycle, so FPF. It's done molting, so it's a C, middle code. Its last code is F for formative plumage, and it's still in its first cycle, FCF. Now it's going to begin its second prebasic molt, so it's molting P, middle code. Last code, B for basic, and its first code will be S for second prebasic. If we can't tell for certain that it's its second prebasic, we could use D, would be accurate as well. Just definitive, it's more of an umbrella. So second prebasic or definitive prebasic. The second basic plumage is inseparable from subsequent plumages, so we can just call it definitive cycle basic. And then its subsequent molt would be definitive prebasic, and then definitive cycle basic, and so forth. So let's go through this again with the complex alternate strategy bird. This would be most of your migratory warblers that have particularly long distance warblers that have pre-alternate molt. FPJ, FCJ, FPF, FCF. Now it's undergoing its first pre-alternate molt. So you capture this bird on, this would be on the wintering grounds if we're talking about a migratory warbler. It's molting P, it's molting into its alternate plumage A, still within its first cycle. That would result in the first cycle alternate. It would breed in this plumage. After the breeding season, it would start its second pre-basic molt. So it's molting, middle code P. It's molting into the basic plumage, the last code's B, and it's a second cycle bird, SPB, or you could say DPB. Once it's done with that, definitive cycle basic, it'll migrate back to the wintering grounds, begin its pre-alternate molt again. We would capture it, see that it's molting, give it a P, recognize that it's molting into alternate plumage A. We would see that there's no juvenile plumage or a hint of a molt limit. So we'd say DPA. This would result in DCA and so forth. Okay. So just what I like to do with my volunteers, and I suggest people who want to get good with the WRP system, if you want to practice this, wrap your heads around the 4 molt strategies: simple basic strategy, complex basic strategy, complex alternate strategy, and simple alternate strategy, right? Wrap your head around those 4 strategies and then pick one. And then in your mind, run through, starting with the bird in the nest, and associate a WRP code with it. And I do this with volunteers at my banding station. I'll be like, hey, Pedro, I don't know if Pedro's on the line. He's really good at this. Like, Pedro, complex alternate strategy, WRP codes, go. And he'll sit there and he's like, okay, starting in the nest, FPJ, FCJ, FPF, FCF, FPA, FCA, SPB, DCB, DPA, DCA, and so forth. And what this does is, unlike the calendar year system, where once again it's an arbitrary date, to master this system, you have to understand the life cycle phonologies, right? You have to understand the different plumages and molts throughout the life of these birds. So it forces you to become a better naturalist, right? A better ornithologist. And that's kind of the power of the system. Not only are you aging these birds more precisely, you're learning yourself. There's a lot of information included within these WRP codes, right? They're reflective of what the bird is doing. Just to show how universal this system is, here's a Western slaty ant shrike that I captured in Costa Rica. And once again, if you go around the world, I regularly band in the Congo Basin, in Central America, South America, North America. You see these same pre-formative molt patterns playing out time and time again. Here's that classic block placement pattern that Peter Pyle talks about, where you can see the lesser and median coverts and the greater coverts have been replaced. They're contrasting with juvenile primary coverts and juvenile flight feathers. So this is a molt limit indicative of a formative plumage bird. So we look at this bird and we can start with the middle code. Is it molting? No, C. What plumage is it in? It's clearly in formative plumage, F. And if it's in formative plumage, what molt cycle is it in? Remember, it's in juvenile formative plumage, it's always in the first molt cycle, so FCF. Here, you think you mastered the WRP system? Here's a tricky bird. And I like this bird because it also shows, I think, just how much information you can glean from these WRP codes. So this is a yellow-rumped warbler that's obviously molting. You can see it's going through a symmetrical wing molt, right? So if it's going through a symmetrical wing molt, we know that that's a complete molt. That's with this species, it's only going to be a pre-basic molt. But which pre-basic molt? Second, third, definitive. There's some other clues here that we could get a little more accurate with, right? Here you can see the corresponding primary coverts are being replaced with these flight feathers that are being molted in. However, the flight feathers that haven't been molted in yet and their corresponding primary coverts are long, pointy, and worn. They're quite juvenile. And in fact, you can see a remnant molt limit here where we have the alula, the lesser alula, and the alula covert, and a molt limit of a formative plumage alula covert contrasting with the lesser alula. So we have basic plumage, juvenile plumage, formative plumage, and then here, these black feathers with this white tipping, this is the remnant alternate plumage, the first alternate plumage. So this is the rare circumstance in warblers that have adhere to a complex alternate strategy where they have pre-alternate molt, where when they're undergoing their second pre-basic molt, you can get 4 generations of plumage. And I get really excited when I see these birds, and I'm sure molt aficionados do too, right? So formative, first alternate, juvenile, and second basic. So is this bird molting? Yes, pre. right? What's it molting into? It's molting into a basic plumage. And we can use these other little clues, the presence of formative and juvenile plumage, to recognize that it's going through its second pre-basic molt, not its third or fourth. Definitive would also work here too, if you weren't as confident. If you just see a bird symmetrically molting wing feathers and it's a warbler, chances are it's going to be a DPB, right? Here's a Carolina wren, and just think back to those Carolina wrens that I went through from Louisiana. Remember how black the barring was, how distinct it was, how close together the barring was. Here we can see the barring is spread far apart. It's not very black. So this is juvenile plumage. This is all juvenile plumage, but look at this. This one feather is molting, but it's not molting at S1 or P1, which is where typically the molt would start if it was going through a pre-basic molt. If you remember, these birds go through eccentric preformative molts. So this is the beginning of an eccentric preformative molt. So for the codes, it's molting, obviously. Which plumage is it molting into? It's leaving its juvenile plumage and going into its formative plumage. And if it's doing that, what cycle is it in first? So this is a first preformative bird. Here's a pretty bird, yellow-bellied wattle-eye from Equatorial Guinea in Central Africa. I don't even need to open the wing. You can see its block replacement pattern indicative of a formative plumage bird. Look at these inner greater coverts contrasting with these juvenile outer greater coverts, right? All these primary coverts are juvenile, the flight feathers are juvenile. Isn't that amazing how this block replacement pattern associated with formative plumage birds just pops up around the world? It's incredible. So here's that block replacement pattern here. So since we have a molt limit, that's that classic formative plumage molt limit, we can age this bird. Is it molting? No. So C. Which plumage is it in? Formative. What cycle is the formative plumage in? First. So this is an FCF bird. Once again, if you were trying to apply the calendar system to this bird, it would fail miserably because you wouldn't know when this bird, wouldn't know if this was a hatchet or a second year bird, and you would be forced to call it an unknown. So let's go through a couple blue jays, some photos I've taken recently. Blue jays are pretty easily aged because their definitive basic plumage is characterized by distinctly blue primary coverts with little bit of black barring. So we can see this bird, see how blue it is with black barring. We know that this is not juvenile plumage. None of this is juvenile plumage. There's no molt limit. The bird is not molting. So C, what plumage is it in? It's in basic. And is it in second, third, fourth? We don't know. So we say definitive. It's a definitive cycle basic blue jay. Here's a very different blue jay where you can see these dusky colored primary coverts with no barring. And look at all this juvenile plumage. It's not molting at all. There's no molt going on in the coverts. So we'd say C. It's in juvenile plumage, clearly 100%, so J. And what cycle is the juvenile plumage in? F. Here's a blue jay where, once again, these look quite juvenile because they're dusky with not a lot of blue or black barring, but we have some molting of the greater coverts. So what is going on with this bird? It is molting P. But since this is this partial molt, it's not molting any flight feathers, this bird is leaving its juvenile plumage and undergoing its preformative molt. So it's going into its formative plumage. Which cycle is that in? First. And one more example of a blue jay. Here, once again, what do you think? I'll just give you a minute. Are these bright blue with black barring? No, they're not. So this is retained juvenile plumage. Here's formative plumage, right? So we have this nice molt limit, but look here, it's molting a flight feather. This is P1. It just shed P1 is growing this in. Blue jays don't have complete preformative molt, so the only time you would have symmetrical wing molt is when they're going through pre-basic molts. So is this bird molting? Yes. Which molt is it? Which plumage is it going into? Basic. But here we have 3 generations of plumage. One here, second basic, juvenile, and formative. So we know that this is going into its second pre-basic molt, right? You could also just say that this is a definitive pre-basic molt, and that works too. But we can be a little more specific, just showing some of the flexibility of these codes. Oh, one more, Blue Jay. Pretty straightforward. We'll just go fast. Molting, no. Are these adult, definitive, basic looking feathers? No, they're juvenile. Here's formative. So we know it's a formative plumage bird, and formative plumage birds occur in the first cycle. So let me just take a step back and shamelessly plug a book. If you guys are interested in a really great introduction to the WRP system, as well as an overview of molt strategies in songbirds, my collaborator Eric Johnson and I published this book a few years ago. It's really focused on neotropical birds, where we used over 70,000 captures from the central Amazon, as well as thousands and thousands of photos that we took from handling these birds for over a decade in the field in the central Amazon. So it's basically like the Pyle guide for tropical birds, but there's photos. Wouldn't that be nice? And instead of the calendar year system, of course, we're using the WRP system, so you can accurately categorize age of these tropical birds. Of course, given the diversity of birds in the tropics, this is just a subset of the birds. However, it's a good representation of the different bird families that you would capture in lowland tropics. And molt is, as we talked about, is often phylogenetically conserved. So if you're learning about Samnemanes from the central Amazon, but you're working in the western Amazon, you can use this book to provide some insight in what you should be looking for in those Samnemanes and in the western Amazon, for example. So in addition to great introductions of WRP and molt, we also have nice figures that show seasonality and the distribution of age classes throughout the year, and nice photos, so forth. Within that book, there's multiple tables and figures. This is one table that summarizes the WRP codes. And nothing should be new here in the first position. We have first, second, third. We went through all that. In the third position, we have juvenile, formative, alternate, auxiliary, formative, supplemental, basic, unknown. But look here in the second position, we have CP. And what's this A code? We didn't go over that, right? This is for after a given plumage. And you're probably thinking, oh my God, another code? Yes, one last code. And this code is quite useful because if you have species with incomplete definitive pre-basic molts, like some large woodpeckers, for example, you can say after second cycle basic or after third cycle basic. It's also quite useful for species with complete preformative molts. So if you think about that inserted molt within the first cycle, that preformative molt, it's often partial or incomplete. If it is complete, we can't separate many times formative plumage birds in their first cycle from definitive basic plumage birds in their second and subsequent cycles. We lose that ability. So we can say after formative or after juvenile plumage, for example. So just once again, going over this third code, and the reason why I'm touching on this last, I'm touching on it lightly, is it's really good to master the other codes before you start using this code. Make sure that you fully understand the system and can age birds before you start implementing this A code. But just a reminder that middle code, P for molting birds, C for non-molting birds, and we can use A for after a given plumage. So good examples come from cardinals. Cardinals have complete preformative molts. And so these birds, formative plumage birds, become indistinguishable from definitive cycle basic birds. In this case, we can use after auxiliary formative plumage or after juvenile plumage. Cardinals are weird because they have this auxiliary preformative molt in their first cycle. We'll talk a little bit about that. For other birds, like on the West Coast, like wren tit, swallows that have complete preformative molts, we can use this A code to say after first cycle juvenile. So let's just run through how we would use this A code. Let's start with we'll go through the phonology of northern cardinal plumages. These are all photos from Louisiana. Here we have a cardinal, looks like it just tumbled out of the nest, right? Has all this ratty juvenile plumage. that clearly you can see the poor quality of this plumage needs to be replaced. I mean, when you look at juvenile birds, you can see the evolutionary necessity of having a pre-formative molt to replace some of these feathers. Which is this bird molting? There's no molt, so C. Which plumage is it in? J. Which cycle? F. So this is a first cycle juvenile bird. Here's where things get weird with cardinals. Here you can see that juvenile plumage, but here's this bright red feathers being molted in. This is that auxiliary preformative molt. It occurs in northern cardinals and cardinalid buntings, but it's unclear how common it is in cardinalid bunting. So things like indigo bunting, for example. And this bird was actually part of I was doing little experiments with them in Louisiana, and Sue Dong probably remembers this, where we were taking feathers in these auxiliary formative plumage birds and clipping them. So I clipped the tips of them, you can see here, and you'll see in the next photo, to actually see if really this is a separate plumage or it's just a protracted preformative molt, right? That just occurs over longer periods of time, and giving the appearance of two different molts. But it appears to be they are distinct molts. This is an auxiliary preformative. So here's this weird plumage that you really only find in cardinals, and a strange bird in the Amazon called Percnostula rufifrons. So is this bird molting? It's not. Which plumage is it in? We use the X code for auxiliary formative plumage. And which cycle is this in? It's in its first cycle. Here, it's leaving the auxiliary formative plumage, and it's going through its pre-formative molt. So these molts tend to happen in somewhat rapid succession. Juvenile plumage leaves the nest, goes through its auxiliary preformative molt, replaces those little bits of lesser coverts, and then shortly thereafter will start sometimes a complete molt. And it's quite variable, the extent of the preformative molt. The further north you go in Cardinal's range, the less common complete preformative molts are, but in Louisiana, they're quite common. So here you can see this bird is going through a complete preformative molt. Here's those auxiliary formative feathers. Here you can see the little clipped tips of them from when I was doing my experiment, and it looked like they were replacing them. And it's starting to molt other coverts as well as flight feathers, going through a complete preformative molt. So is this bird molting? Yes. It's leaving its auxiliary formative plumage, entering its formative plumage. And this is still in the first cycle. When it's done with this molt, it looks like this. So now this looks like a definitive cycle basic bird, but it could also be a formative plumage cardinal that went through a complete preformative molt, leaving no trace of a molt limit. So now they're indistinguishable, right? Once again, this bird, obviously, if we're using calendar year system, a hatching year bird, it's going through its preformative molt, first preformative. When it's done, looks like this, and now it's somewhat indistinguishable from those younger birds. So we can use an A code here, right? Because they have complete preformative molts. And we can say which was the last known plumage it was definitely in. And we can say that was the auxiliary formative. So we can say after auxiliary formative, right? First cycle auxiliary formative. That's how the A code is used. But once again, I would master the system not using the A code. And once you have a good handle on it, start looking at examples of birds that have incomplete definitive pre-basic molts, like woodpeckers, gulls, or they have like plumage maturation, like gulls, or large raptors, for example. You can use this A code, or songbirds that have complete preformative molts. And you can start implementing this A code. So take home message from all of this: calendar year system separates cohorts just fine in North America, but it's incredibly temperate centric, and not just centric to temperate zones, but those in the northern hemispheres. WRP system is universal, and it provides more information than simply cohort differentiation. And let me just once again state that I'm not proselytizing for WRP. There's plenty of research organizations that are simply interested in banding birds in mass and separating cohorts. So you can have somebody who's trained to look at a skull ossification, say, okay, this skull is closed, look at a date in the Pyle guide, okay, it's before this date, write down after hatchery and move on, right? Make it very formulaic. So if you want fast age differentiation based on cohort separation, calendar year system works great in North America. WRP does that and then more. It provides information about the life cycle phonology of that bird. And it requires the practitioners to have a knowledge of the natural history of the bird. Clearly, patterns of molt and plumage would fall into this category as well. So that was just a gentle introduction. I also have a tutorial on my website. You're more than welcome to go check out and drop me any emails or questions that you might have about the system. And I'd be happy to take any questions. So thank you very much.